Hello, how are you doing? There are so many good new books coming out, and I have two big piles of books that I recently acquired here that I want to discuss and why I'm so interested in reading them. Many of them are books that have just been published here in the UK for the very first time in May, and that publishers have kindly sent me. Other books are ones that I purchased myself just because I'm really interested in reading them. And so, yeah, I'm going to go through and talk about all of them. But first, something really special. So the UK Indie Book Awards were the shortlists for these awards were just announced last week. So you can see the fiction category here, and there's Clara and the Sun, and there's Piranesi and Still Life. So yeah, and Mrs. Death, which is a novel that I've still been really wanting to read, but also the nonfiction category shortlist. And I always rely on book prizes to point me towards new good nonfiction, because I don't read all that much nonfiction. I mainly just read novels, and so I'm quite keen on reading some of the nonfiction titles. So yeah, I have the ones that I'm really interested in here. So there's Crying in the H Mart by Michelle Zauner, which I've discussed before and which I've been meaning to read. My partner has read this and said it's really good, of the author's memoir of exploring her Korean heritage, having been raised in America and being fully engrossed in American culture, and sort of rediscovering her Korean heritage through food and the exploration of that. And so yeah, I've been really wanting to read this, and I love books about food. And there's another book on the list all about food, which is called Scoff by Penn Vogler, which is a history of food consumption here in England, and looking at how that relates to the class system and what people eat and how that relates to class, which is a really interesting take and look at it. And me being an American who's lived here in the UK my whole adult life, there's many foods that I've grown accustomed to eating over the course of living here. So it'll be really interesting to look at the history of UK food and how that fits in. There's also another memoir called House of Music, raising the Kanneh-Masons, by one of the members of that family, Kadiatu Kanneh-Mason, and it's about a group of seven siblings that grew up in Nottingham, and they were all very musical, and they grew up to sort of take the classical music world by storm, and how political events sort of intersected with their lives and their work in music. So that sounds really interesting. I've heard really good things about this. There's also the book of Trespass by Nick Hayes, where he explores, I think he says, like, there are the physical land in England, about 92% of it, the public isn't allowed to actually walk upon and to visit. And so he takes the step to actually traverse the boundaries of what is allowed to be open to the public and what isn't, and so he goes upon some of these lands, and he writes about the things that he finds there, and about how the sort of divisions in society based on these like portions of land. And then there's also another memoir called How We Met by Huma Qureshi, and who I think had a collection of short stories, a debut collection of short stories out last year. But this is a memoir about her experiences growing up as a woman of South Asian heritage, growing up in the UK, going to school and developing romances. But then when she was at home, the experiences and expectations of her family, and about falling in love with a man who's not of South Asian heritage, and the issues that presents. So yeah, it's a really interesting group of books on the shortlist. I'm hoping to explore some of these over the coming months. But then I have some other nonfiction that I'm also really looking forward to reading. And I went to a book event recently recently where the author Katherine Rundell was speaking there, and she's a biographer and writer of nonfiction, and she was speaking about a book actually that she has coming out later this summer, I think, which is about the lives of different animals, different curious animals, including wombats. And I have this special love and interest in wombats, so that really perked my interest. But she was such a passionate and interesting speaker that it made me really interested in her work. And she also published, she's very prolific, she also published earlier this year this biography of Donne, the romantic English poet. And I really don't know all that much about his life. I think he had many children. He converted from Catholicism to Protestantism, and had many dramatic events in his life, as well as being known as one of like the great romantic English poets, and I had a special interest in his poems when I was a teenager. I don't know where this came from, but I read a lot of them and just really connected to them. And very pretentiously, in my yearbook at the end when I finished high school, they put everyone's pictures in the yearbook, and there's a bit of text beneath everyone's pictures which you can write yourself. And a lot of people just give sort of shout outs to their friends or their favorite bands or something, but I very pretentiously included a quote from Donne, which just sort of seemed appropriate to kind of this like transition period in your life between teenage life and adulthood. And I don't know what people thought of that, but that was in my high school yearbook. So anyway, that's the way of saying I am really interested in finding more about Donne's life, and super excited about this book called Super Infinite. Next is another memoir, and it's called This Is Not a Pity Memoir by Abby Morgan, and it's about how the author, as she was going about her normal everyday life, and on a day which felt like any other day, she suddenly found her husband had suddenly died, and so obviously this completely upended and changed her life. And so she's talking about the experience of that, and I think that's a really striking title to talk about a subject like this. That's kind of everyone's worst nightmare, to wake up and find someone that's so close to you has died, and so she talks about the process of dealing with that. Also just out in paperback is the nonfiction book The Transgender Issue by Shon, Faye, and this first came out later in last year, the paperback has just come out, and I'm so eager to read this, because the issue of transgender rights and lives has been such a contentious issue here in the UK and in other parts of the world as well, and it makes me so frustrated how the rights and lives and humanity of trans women and men have been politicized and legislated in a way which is really detrimental to the mental and physical health of their lives. And I've had a number of discussions like this in real life with friends and family I know, and so I'm really eager to read an account which addresses all of these issues, and how to better equip me to respond to having discussions about this and to learn more about it. Then there's the book The Premonitions Bureau by Sam Knight, and I spoke about this book in a video earlier this year in when I was looking at a list of some of the most hotly anticipated books of the year, and this is sort of tipped as probably going to be one of the best books of 2022. And so a man who was a psychiatrist in the 1980s, he set up this group called the Premonitions Bureau, looking into accounts of people who had premonitions and the outcomes of that. And the possible reasons for that. And so he looks at a number of different cases, and some of the results are really surprising. So it sounds like an absolutely fascinating topic. And finally, in my pile of nonfiction, there's the book Sentient by Jackie Higgins. And this is meant to be a really great account looking at different animals and creatures from all over the world, from land, sea, and air, and how they have adapted to sense the world in different ways, and how this can make us reevaluate how we as humans like sense and perceive the world around us. And I have such a fascination with animals and watching nature documentaries, like a lot of people do. I mean, nature documentaries are like massively popular thing, and so yeah, I just enjoy reading about animals so much, and so looking forward to this. So on to looking at some fiction, and first I have a few books by authors that I've read before, so I'm really eager to read their new books. And so there's a novel called Here Goes Nothing by Steve Toltz, who's an Australian author, and I've read his novel Quicksand before, which I really enjoyed. And this novel is about a man who is murdered, and he didn't, while he was living, he didn't believe in the afterlife, but then he finds that he has an afterlife, and he's able to still exist in some spiritual way in the world. And he discovers that his wife is being seduced by his murderer, and so it's following the story of that, which sounds quite similar to the movie Ghost. I don't know if it draws any inspiration from that, or is quite different from that, and I probably wouldn't be so interested in that story if I hadn't read Steve Toltz before, and think he's a really interesting writer and has this kind of humorous perspective on the world, a kind of quite a quirky, like different way of looking at the world. And so yeah, really excited to read this. There's a new novel by Sophie Ward called The Schoolhouse, and I absolutely loved her debut novel called Love and Other Thought Experiments, which was longlisted for the Booker Prize, and which I did an interview here with her on my channel, talking all about it. And this novel is about a woman that lives a fairly isolated and reclusive life in the north of London, and she works in a library, so instantly endeared towards her. And she grew up in the 1970s and went to an experimental school, and had a lot of traumatic experiences there, which is kind of blocked out, and at the time she wrote about them in a journal and then has just sort of forgotten about them. So it's about her exploring her past, which she's really tried to block out. So sounds like quite a dramatic story. And there's a new novel from Benjamin Myers called The Perfect Golden Circle, and I'd read his novels The Offing and Beastings, and just absolutely love his writing in the way he describes the natural world in his fiction. And this is a novel about two men in the late 1980s in England who are quite different from each other, but they meet and they form this odd connection where they travel around the country creating these crop circles. And so it's about the consequences of that, and how this kind of like highlights divisions within English society. Then I have a book which is a reprint of a novel which was first published in the 1950s in America, and it's actually never been published here in the UK, so that's quite exciting. It's called Maud Martha by Gwendolyn Brooks, who I think was the first African-American woman to win a Pulitzer Prize. And she was primarily a poet, but this is a novel about a woman that grew up in 1940s Chicago on the South Side, and it's about her life and how her lighter-skinned husband has very different aspirations from her. So it's about the conflicts that they encounter. Grown Ups by Marie Aubert, and this is a Norwegian novel about a woman who's become professionally successful and is in her 40s, but then begins to feel slightly panicked that she is single and doesn't have children, especially when she goes to visit her sister, and how she starts fighting with her sister and flirting with her sister's husband. So it's following her story and how sometimes as adults we can kind of regress to this childish mode when we're confronted with these large issues in our lives. Children of Sugarcane by Joanne Joseph, and the author was inspired to write this novel when she learned that her great-grandmother was an indentured laborer living in South Africa, and she was one of 150,000 Indians that were shipped from India to South Africa to be indentured laborers and grow sugarcane for their British colonial masters in the 1800s. And so she wrote a novel and a story inspired upon her great-grandmother's experiences. So yeah, it sounds like a really powerful story. Ruth and Penn by Emilie Pine, and this is a debut novel about two women over the course of a single day in Dublin in October of 2019, and how these two women are sort of at a crossroads in their lives. Ruth is married and she's contemplating leaving her husband, and then there's Penn, who's a writer that is trying to build up the courage to admit something to someone, to admit what she really wants in her life. So I always think it's quite like bold for a writer to set a story over the course of a single day in Dublin, because that is the device of Ulysses by James Joyce. And so yeah, it's quite a bold thing to do, but I'm like so up for it. This World Does Not Belong to Us by Natalie Garcia Ferrer, who is a writer from Ecuador. And this is the story of a boy that was expelled from his home by two strangers, and much later when he's an adult he returns to that childhood home to explore this past, but not necessarily his family's past or the physical location of it, but the strange creatures that live in this place where he initially grew up, and his sort of connection with these like creepy crawly insects and things which inhabit this space, which is a really unique way of telling a story. So yeah, I'm really keen to try this. Model Citizens by Daniel Shand, and this is a novel about our relationship with technology, and it's set in a world where people are able to make clones of themselves to escape from the daily grind, which reminds me a bit of the concept and the premise of this TV show I've been watching called Severance, which is a really eerie and creepy and like odd show, but yeah, it's about a man who is able to do that, and but who just sort of wastes his time and spends his days online obsessing about his status, and so yeah, it sounds like a really interesting book. Then to finish, I have a few new books of short stories, and the first one I want to talk about actually sounds, the subject matter sounds somewhat related to this novel, and it's Reward System by Jem Calder. And I actually saw the author speak at a book event, the same event that I was talking about with Katherine Rundell earlier, and his reading was so funny and pointed, and these short stories are about all our relationship with modern technology and how our identities are kind of filtered through our online lives, and he takes a kind of fresh perspective on that, which is very pointed and comic, as well as making like a serious statement. And these have been described as books of connected short stories, which, as I've said many times, it's kind of my favorite form of book, to have these interconnected short stories. And so Sally Rooney is a big fan of this book, and she says of it, Reward System is an exhilarating and beautiful book by an extraordinarily gifted writer. Reading these stories, I found myself thinking thinking newly and differently about contemporary life. Then there's the collection The Secret Lives of Church Ladies by Disha Filia, which came out in America quite a while ago and was shortlisted for the National Book Award, and I was keen to read it at the time, but it's finally come out here in the UK. And this is a collection of stories about Black church-going women. Some of them are fully grown women, some of them are teenagers, exploring their different lives and their relationship with the church. And the writer Calabazuma Nelson said of this book, this book is the one I've passed to friends, family, and anyone else who will listen to me rave about how warm and wonderful this writing is. And finally, there's the collection Walking on Cowrie Shells by Nana Nkweti, who's a Cameroonian American author. Cameroon! Sorry, that's a Drag Race reference. But these stories are described as genre bending because they draw on inspiration from myth and horror and graphic novels to tell these stories. The author Ya Gyasi calls it a wonderful debut, and Carmen Maria Machado calls it a delightful, rollicking debut. So yeah, these sound really intriguing. So those are all the books I'm going to talk about. Let me know if you read any of these and would recommend them, or if you're especially interested on reading any of these books now that I've talked about them. And it'll be really interesting to see who wins the Indie Book Awards towards the end of June, when the announcement is made during Independent Bookshop Week here in the UK. So that'll be fun to see, and an excuse to go out to bookshops and buy even more books. So yeah, can't get enough. So I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.